let's keep this in mind, that they're not allies.
Xi-Putin Relations and the View from Riga with...
Hello, Jordan. My name is Aleksandra Bērziņa-Čerenkova, and I run the China Studies Center at Riga Stradins University. I also am heading the Asia Studies at the Latvian Institute of International Affairs, so that's more in the think tank side. I'm also a proud affiliate of King's College London, a Lao China Institute, and a European China Policy Fellow at Merrick's. So that's about it.
Great. So let's bring it back to the early days of the Xi-Putin relationship. Why as soon as Xi came to power, did they try to, frame the relationship publicly as this bromance?
Well, because in authoritarian countries, one might argue, these personal displays of what the leaders think, what they like, of their likes, their dislikes, and their sympathies matter in shaping the public opinions. So I'm sure, and that I do agree with those who believe that it's much more complicated than that when we do elite screening, elite monitoring, we shouldn't just focus on the headlines. We should, be able to pinpoint the great cardinals, the people who are behind the ideologies. That is all true. But let's not forget that for the wider audiences in both of these countries, and I do research both of these countries, my work is to follow these information sphere, the Russian one. I'm a discourse analyst by training. So in my, what we, at the end of the day, what we find important is what rings with the populations. And what these two people, how they appear, how they communicate their relationship, does indeed ring back with the population.
Do you think they enjoy the time they spend together? Of all the if I'm Putin and I could be hanging out on a yacht, or I'm hidden up in that a castle, is it a highlight of my month to get to spend an hour making jianbing with Xi, or is this kind of a chore?
See, the funny thing is you said jianbing, because and that is something that really in my mind is interesting, because the pancake making thing, it rings back differently with the Chinese and the Russian audience. When Russians hear this, they immediately imagine blini, and the Chinese imagine jianbing. So again, it's a funny statement. But that aside, it's hard for me to comment, right? Because under the situation that we are in now, even if he was the funnest person in the world to be around, and I would still advise you against going on his yacht, and especially don't take any tea from that guy.
I shouldn't be laughing. That's horrifying.
But another thing that matters is that Xi has been a guest many times in St. Petersburg, and Putin has hosted him in St. Petersburg. And that, again, is something for the domestic population. Putin has been displaying himself as this person from St. Petersburg, and who's trying to raise the profile of the city, of this once capital, to give it international status. And Xi going to these meetings, and also kind of, that again feeds back to this friendship. He understands Putin as this St. Petersburg person.
What has each country been trying to get out of the other over the past decade? Perfect. What do they want? What do both sides want in the relationship?
So the book that is coming out any day now that I wrote, I use this concept of perfect imbalance to characterize the relationship, and I do believe in it. So and I borrowed it from the gaming industry of all places. And in the gaming industry, perfect imbalance basically means creating such gameplay that the player who's not as strong can still win using this environment. So this environment kind of plays in your favor, even if you're not as strong as the other player, and you can use this to your advantage. So my opinion is that, of course, there's a lot of complementarity in the Russian-Chinese relations. Of course, the obvious thing that we all go to, it's almost a cliche, are the natural resources. But if you think about it, it is important for Russia. It kind of provides it with some leverage that it has this market in the East. And it has been using this rhetorically as well, saying that we do have a market in the East. We saw that in 2014 as well. So that's the obvious one. On the level of stories they tell, of strategic narratives, China and Russia have also been pushing this narrative of cooperation in innovation. In my assessment, that is more of a wishful thinking, and I also write about it, that It feels that this is something that they want, especially the Russian population, to buy, because the Russian population is really heavy on the Chinese are, using our resources and cutting down our forests, kind of the narrative. So this innovation is more of a wishful thinking. However, I do not also side with those colleagues who say that there is absolutely nothing for China to be gained technologically when it comes to Russia. China does refer to Russia as veteran, which is, of course, a nice way to call someone who's not as good at something as they used to be. But at the same time, it's like a respectful way to tell you you're old and you're not quite it anymore. But that aside, there are technologies, of course, undeniably, that Russia possesses, be it space, be it military, that China, with all its money, with all its strategic planning, still lacks. And a lot of the experience that Russia has, for example, in space flight and in human life preservation in space, just cannot be bought. Russia has been doing this for decades and has paid for every mistake with blood, sweat, and tears. And so for China, it wouldn't make sense to go that way. It would make sense to see what can be gained here. So that's two, right? So first of all, the resources. Second of all, technology, right? Third of all, of course, let's be clear, both countries understand that their relationship is detrimental for Eurasian and maybe global stability. They understand, and both of these countries have some sort of a mission thinking, mission ideology in them ingrained, right? Especially the Russians. For the Chinese, it's about getting back on the horse, getting past the 100 years of accumulation. For Russia, it's also about proving themselves and this mission. We're the good ones, actually. We're the misunderstood ones. So this narrative, and that also puts them on the proverbial, on that one side across from many other players. So there's that level. So they cannot really avoid one another. And they do see that they have to, of course, both of them approach this a little differently. Russia is aware of the differences. Sometimes my colleagues, often enough, refer to this as the asymmetry. And others fight against it and say that Russia still has a lot of leverage, be it as it may, but still Russia is trying to exercise other instruments to maybe offset this quote-unquote asymmetry, such as, for example, trying to involve India, trying to fall back on other partners, to avoid granting China this role of this leading partner in the relationship. But still, so I argue there's a lot complementarity between these two.
I want to talk about is this sort of Russian public uncomfortability with dependence on China, which is about to be multiplied pretty dramatically as these sanctions come down the pipeline. Can you explore that dynamic a little bit more?
Well, certainly the Russians, who am I to speak in the name of the Russian general public? What do they think? It's hard to say, but it still kind of feels, and this is absolutely unscientific what I'm saying, maybe a little bit on some of my anthropologist colleagues would agree with my methodology, but definitely not my IR colleagues. But I would still have to say that, of course, the Russians are uncomfortable with, they do not hold any hopes as to China being a helpful hand, or China being, or they do not also believe that China at any point in time would be willing to do Russia's bidding. At the same time, it would seem that this opportunity, the two heads of Russia, right, of the imperial kind of this understanding, one head looking up towards Europe and the other looking towards Asia, it does feel like it gives them some advantage that could be, in theory, used. But at the same time, again, who am I to speak in the name of the Russian population? However, the people that I have spoken to, at the same time, they fear that Russia will not be able to ride this advantage, and they will end up losing out to China.
You also alluded to the idea that the relationship sort of shores up Putin and sort of national confidence in the Russian path, that kind of the decisions that that Putin is making around the world is the right one. Talk a little bit about the sort of like self-reinforcing autocracy dynamic that happens between the two countries.
Certainly, and I think I'm trying to avoid talking about the war in Ukraine so far, but I will definitely be talking about it later. I hope you also will allow me to. But this is the moment when I already have to invoke that and where I already have to mention that, because in the early days, it kind of felt that Beijing was it wasn't very, very happy about what Russia was doing. It was very ambiguous, but at the same time was happy that it was causing the West headache. And I think that the reinforcement that you just talked about has a lot to do with that. So both countries see eye to eye when it comes to this total sovereignty, whatever happens within our borders is our business kind of thing. Ironic, given the situation in Ukraine, the war in Ukraine. Also, the idea of some kind of a Western ideology that's poisoning the minds, and that is basically being weaponized to undermine the regimes, that's also shared in Beijing and Moscow. And also the idea that, but at the same time, the idea that these countries have a lot of resources, they have a lot of potential, they're just extremely strong, populous, wide, and that this idea that it's been exploited by these outside forces before, and it can happen again unless we're careful. In the Chinese mythology of today, it's the idea of the chaos that will come if something happens to the Communist Party. And in the Russian mythology of today, it's the falling of the values of the Russian, and it's interesting. It's actually being translated across culture, because we know that both China and Russia are very multi-ethnic, multicultural. So in Russia, the story goes towards the Russian, the ethnic population. It goes, this is against the values of Orthodox Christianity that we're the last bastion for. Whereas among the Muslim population, the same story, just take out Orthodox Christianity, insert Muslim faith. But that's the general, and that's what really that translates.
So let's bring it to February 22. What struck you most watching the lead up to the war, and how both countries were talking about what was happening?
What struck me most was that I did not predict full-on invasion on Ukraine. So that's starting from that. Me and my colleagues, we did not expect that. So that struck me. But of course, when it comes to China and Russia, we're kind of used to the Russian rhetoric being bullying, being challenging, saying this is not true. Somehow everybody's saying we will attack Ukraine, and there's just two countries in the world who are saying that's not going to happen, and that's us and Ukraine, and everyone else is just they're stupid for thinking that. So of course this blatant lie and this messaging, which makes no sense, that struck me, that keeps striking me. On the Chinese side, of course, we expected ambiguity. We expected saying all of these statements without really saying nothing. China's in a kind of a between a rock and a hard place here. Of course, and it was interesting to see China's position evolving, because of course it does have deep links with Ukraine also. And it's still interesting because the Chinese position hasn't fully formed. It's still interesting to watch how they're maneuvering between this almost want to talk about, how this is the U.S.'s fault, and kind of be celebratory in a sense that, look, what this is what U.S. caused. And on the other hand, being wary of, oh my God, this is instability. This is what we fear, right? And I would also have to say that reflects in the little things. My colleagues have pointed out, for example, that the Xinhua reports, on one hand, they feature sovereignty, all countries, but at the same time, China acknowledges that Ukraine is a special case. Who isn't a special case, may I ask, right? So it's the historic, but at the same time, there's a report on Xinhua website, and the visual for it is the kind of this bony European hand trying to scratch Ukraine, and on the other hand, a bear claw. That's not very, that's quite telling that they still the visual of Russia as this bear claw. And I'm trying to tie this back to your question. So I think that on one hand, China is also using this, trying to maybe see whether this is the time when it grasps that heightened role. It's no surprise that some voices have said, well, maybe China can mediate, right? So, okay, should we do that? But at the same time, it's so tempting for China to use this to speak against the U.S., to show that us too suffer from the United States hegemony. And we saw that in the statements of the spokespeople of Zhao Nijian and of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. But on the other hand, let's not forget, in the Chinese domestic discourse, Russia is portrayed as someone who has taken territories from China as well. That is not forgotten. You have a museum on the Chinese side of the Russian border, which does not allow Russian passport holders in, because it tells a story of a bloodthirsty Russia pillaging China and taking away its territories. So Russia is not the perfect protagonist in the story for China as well. So it's interesting how it will evolve.
Yeah, the amount of kind of layers and contradictions that must be that you see playing out in the ambiguity is really remarkable to watch. Let's not forget, Vladivostok used to be part of the Qing dynasty back in the day. There is some timeline out there where instead of everyone saying, oh, this is the time to move on Taiwan, Xi, for whatever reason, gets it in his head that he wants a new cold port in the East. But anyways, this is a little too fanciful maybe for today. It's interesting sort of watching the Chinese nationalist discourse, because like you can find justifications to be on both sides, right? If you are like a super red online a Chinese person like that, you can find arguments on both sides of this war.
But I think it goes beyond just China, right? And I think what is extremely interesting about and in China actually, I'm just quoting my colleague, one of my Russian colleagues, Igor Denisov, who posted this. He conducts a really close analysis on what is happening in terms of the Chinese messaging, and he's writing about how the Chinese ambassador to Ukraine, how the messaging was, and basically how it was unexpected that, and how he emphasizes that the Chinese policy towards Ukraine has always been friendly, and basically how unexpected it is for them that the locals are that there's a lot of anti-China sentiment, right? So, and they're trying to balance that, and they're trying, to warn their citizens to maybe not even though during the first days of the invasion, the message was, or even before that, display a Chinese flag, say you're Chinese, you have nothing. And now it's like, keep a low profile, everybody. Yeah. So we're seeing, and I think it's really hard to draw a round, beautiful analysis because it's such a developing situation. So, but to go back to what I started with, maybe it's just me and where I sit, because every war, of course, we can say draws lines. But from where I sit, it's very hard in this exact situation with the Russian invasion to talk about, to use the whataboutism argument, to use the comparative argument. Yes, but, or use the who started it argument, that kind of thing, because it's just so blatantly inexcusable.
The sort of thinking about kind of scenarios going forward, if this war, I gotta imagine that she probably had the same assumptions that Putin did, which is that this war would be over quickly. But I'm curious, if you want to speculate a little bit, Una, like to what extent Beijing's calculus changes if this sort of drags out and gets uglier and uglier from Putin's perspective.
Let's keep this in mind, that they're not allies. Russia and China, we hear these opinions, of Russia and China forming an alliance, 2 steps away from adopting a mutual defense clause. For what it's worth, for what my opinion's worth, I do not think that's the case. And I think China writing this out the way they're doing is proof to that.
Let's talk about the view from the Baltics. What does this change from a NATO perspective, from and from a sort of Chinese relations perspective as well?
Well, first of all, I think it's drawn a very clear line of where NATO is, and it's a couple of years ago we were talking about a brain-dead NATO that served its purpose, a remnant of the Cold War, and the Baltic states and Poland and some other, actors within the EU that have seen this firsthand, seen the Russia threat firsthand, were unwilling to give up on NATO, and we're talking about and especially the transatlantic link. We're talking about not really being on the side of European strategic autonomy, not really believing that Europe would do much because our number one threat was Russia. At that time, even though it was after Crimea and even though it was after the Warsaw Summit of NATO, it's still it sounded distant and it sounded exaggerated in a lot of capitals. After Putin's actions and the decision to invade Ukraine, no more. It does sound justified. And during my time in the U.S., and that was 2019, 2020, I interviewed a lot of folks that were in the security establishment and that, were NATO related and had NATO careers in the past and in U.S. military careers in the past. They would refer to us in a friendly way. We were as pestering Washington for support, saying that the end of history is a fiction, saying that there's still issues, and saying that this is not Cold War mentality, but this is simply necessity, that we need this support. And I have to say our Lithuanian neighbors were the most persistent, I guess, up and down in every corridor on the Hill, screaming bloody murder. And now we see it's been justified because we see where the NATO border falls, and we see that outside of that border, yes, we can send weapons, we can send humanitarian aid, we can provide warmth and shelter to the ones who cross over, but nothing beyond that, because anything beyond that would spell an escalation, right? So I guess this is to my knowledge, the NATO 2030 strategic concept has not been adopted yet. They're still deliberating. And I'm sure, and of course, we've been talking about how much the Chinese role is going to grow in that concept, how much the Indo-Pacific is going to become one of these topics that this concept will address. Of course, not in an adversarial way, not saying, China is an adversary, China is but rather calling it a challenge and talking about what can we do. So there was this feeling that the Indo-Pacific is going to steal the thunder from this classic NATO, a line of involvement. Well, not anymore. And now we have Finland and Sweden, not explicitly, trying to join, but still, coming to the summit, Finland joining the summit, the meeting, talking about sending signals that they are looking in the direction of joining NATO. And of course, followed by an crazy statement by the Russian MFA spokesperson, Ms. Zaharova, saying that this will lead to military consequences if Finland, thinks about joining, which is absolutely insane in my humble opinion. So we see two things. First of all, we see NATO is sadly as relevant as ever. And the second thing is it's too early to take that searchlight and point it towards the Indo-Pacific. NATO needs that searchlight here in Europe. And there's another smaller, wider searchlight. Indo-Pacific's fine, but we need NATO to remember what stands in the name. And it says North Atlantic in the name.
Closing thoughts, Una?
Well, do you allow profanities on your show? Because I want to finish with...
Yeah.
Because I want to finish with the with the quote that has been around a lot. And as a Russian, as half Russian, as a person who is in the Russian culture, I'm allowed to say that. And I'm going to say, "Русский военный корабль, иди нахуй." Thank you. But that was, of course, the quote from the Russian warship, "Go fuck yourself."
Acast powers the world's best podcasts. Here's a show that we recommend.
I am excited to announce the Adweek Podcast Network, the first ever podcast network created for brand enthusiasts and anyone curious about the latest trends in marketing, advertising, technology, and culture. Adweek has partnered with leading industry voices to bring you analysis of trends, pressing challenges, and to share top-tier insights to help you level up your career, creativity, and strategy. Starting April 12th, you will get to hear brand new shows like Young Influentials, The Speed of Culture, Adweek Presents, and some of your favorites like Yeah, That's Probably an Ad, CMO Moves, and Season 2 of Metaverse Marketing. We are also happy to be the new home for amazing shows like Brave Commerce, The Great Fail, and To Dine For with Kate Sullivan. Learn more by visiting adweek.com/podcasts. That's adweek.com/podcasts. Listen wherever you get your podcasts.
Acast recommends.